Genesis stood at the edge of the vast, otherworldly schoolyard, eyes widening in wonder at the churning swirl of brilliant colors in the asphalt. It looked less like a playground and more like an unending field of potentials, Simondon's metastable soup of unactualized forms where the pre-individual saturates every corner. Groups of children gathered like strange constellations, not cliques but pulsating crystals, each arrangement embodying its own logic. No sign declared geometry club or art club, but the children's gravitational fields of shared mood, energy, or conceptual play formed ephemeral pockets of activity. Genesis, newly arrived, felt the hum of anxiety beneath his skin, a frisson of possibility that was also fear, for he was a swirl of transductive unity in search of coherence. The sky above was an electric tapestry reminiscent of McLuhan's notion of an all-encompassing medium, living and breathing, contracting the world into a single village, yet bristling with uncharted intensities. The shapes flickering overhead reminded Genesis of viral memes or the pixelated illusions that swirl in hypermedia, a reminder of Virilio's caution that speed can both unite and fragment, that accidents lurk in the folds of real-time transmission. On top of it all was the lingering sense of a technical object in Simondon's sense. Each child and each cluster was a node of intensification, each overshadowed by a potential metamorphosis waiting to happen. The entire environment felt like an entangled network of trans-individual expansions, a place where identity was not set, but emerging out of an interplay of subtle resonances. He tripped over a rolling soccer ball that seemed more like a quantum generator of micro-decisions, each bounce altering the local distribution of variety. Landing face first in a patch of swirling sand, Genesis heard monotone chanting, cogito ergo sum, cogito ergo sum. Rising to his knees, he saw they were miniature embodiments of an extreme Cartesian stance, children who insisted the only anchor of existence was their disembodied logic. Each appeared suspicious of the ephemeral processes swirling around them. They glared at Genesis, voices like mechanical loops. "You do not belong," one intoned. "You have not established your existence through pure reason." There was an insular rigidity in their chanting, a closed system with minimal variety, as though they aimed to reduce every complexity into a single atomic proposition. Perhaps they lived in a self-imposed bubble that blocked out the flux of the environment, ignoring their own pre-individual potentials. Genesis, still dusted with sand, felt that pang of, "I'm not enough," that personal crisis of not fitting into their tidy scheme. But something in him resisted. He was not a finished product but a dynamic process that was constantly wrestling with its environment. "I'm not defined by a single proposition," he mumbled, feeling the dryness in his throat. "I am a process of becoming, an unfolding of metastable tensions." He glanced at the nearest child, who blinked once, resettled into the chanting, and dismissed him as an anomaly. They resumed their loop, unperturbed by data outside their self-contained logic. So Genesis left, a subtle mixture of frustration and renewed conviction. The infiltration of some rigidly coded group was not his path. Even McLuhan's famous line, "The medium is the message," was nowhere near their horizon, for they recognized only their own echo, ignoring the swirling mediums enveloping them. He found himself drifting toward a raucous swirl of color and irrational movement, Dadaist dancers, children in vibrant mismatched clothing flailing about like data points in a chaotic system. They shouted nonsense words that soared overhead, a carnival of pure shock reminiscent of the historical Dada spirit, rejecting reason, reveling in desperation. He hesitated, but the energy beckoned him. He stepped into their throng, trying to match their unpredictable gyrations. They hollered about destroying illusions, celebrating chaos, unbinding sense from syntax. This was a realm of subversion. They were everything the little Cartesian group was not, ephemeral, unmoored from linear logic, each child a microcosm of weird synergy with the environment. The environment for them was a swirling set of potentials, each gesture reconfiguring the local field. One child with clock hands painted on each cheek declared, "Meaning is a trap, embrace nonsense." And the strange beauty was that in their nonsense was an ephemeral truth, By snapping the rigid codex of standard reason, they left open a door for new forms to slip in. It was a reminder of how subversive energies can open fresh lines of flight. Genesis joined their wave for a while, dancing, spinning. He found a reckless joy in letting his limbs flail, in letting the logical constraints on movement vanish. It brought a sense of liberation, as though the entire environment was a transductive playground. Yet after some minutes he recognized another tension within, the partial longing for structure, for a certain impetus to find stable direction. Virilio's caution about speed's illusions flickered in his mind. The flow was exhilarating, but was it truly sustaining? He felt a mild sense of fragmentation, of losing the anchor of continuity. So he peeled off, leaving the swirling Dada kids behind. Not far away, he stumbled upon an enormous mirror. A circle of children, some with carefully etched expressions of angst, peered at themselves in it with an almost Lacanian fascination. The reflection was not stable. Each time Genesis caught a glimpse of himself, he saw a kaleidoscopic refraction, multiple potential identities flickering in and out, reminding him of how perception can diverge from stable self-image. A girl whispered, "Are we just illusions, reflections of another's gaze?" This domain of mirrored fragmentation unleashed a new wave of anxiety in Genesis. Indeed, it highlighted a deeper dimension of the pre-individual field, the disparity that demands resolution. He recalled Simondon's emphasis on how the tension of disparation can eventually create a new dimension, like depth in binocular vision, if integrated properly. Here, though, the children seemed stuck in the tension, unsure how to integrate the swirl of self-fragments. That confrontation forced Genesis to see that the self is not a monolith, but a living, metastable patchwork in need of recurring negotiations. It was both unsettling and enlightening. He felt more integrated for having confronted the mirror's multiplicity, though also more aware of the ongoing disharmony he carried. He resumed wandering and encountered a group engaged in Pythagorean experiments. They stacked blocks, tested liquids in different containers, staged conservation tasks, seeking to understand how knowledge emerges from sensory-motor interactions. He saw them systematically test cause and effect, as though each action was a step in a hierarchical pattern recognition system. That group had a sense of clarity, a certain approach to building knowledge from the ground up. He recognized it was another partial system, structured but perhaps ignoring the wild expansions of Dada or the fractured reflections of the Lacanians. In a far corner, he discovered a cluster of older kids in black leather jackets, corners of their mouths curled in cynicism. They were the Nietzschean bullies, the ones who tested new arrivals by mocking their illusions and forcing them to stare into an abyss of nihilism. They hurled challenges at each child who approached. "What is your value system but a delusion?" Some children cowered and fled. Others tried to argue back but got roped into existential despair. Genesis felt the undertow, that swirling negativity that threatened to erode the fragile sense of identity he'd cobbled together. He mustered some internal resources gleaned from the Dada spontaneity and from the Pythagorean sense of systematic testing. He recognized the bully's assault was just another local configuration, a domain of intensities. He refused to collapse into the gloom. He retorted, "You speak of illusions, but illusions themselves can be generative. Doesn't your cynicism hide an unacknowledged potential for transformation?" This seemed to short-circuit their script, at least momentarily. They parted, scowling but letting him pass. As the afternoon wore on, Genesis found a small garden fenced off from the rest of the schoolyard. Here, a hush prevailed, and children in simple robes engaged in mindful breathing, reminiscent of a Buddhist corner. They intoned phrases about impermanence and emptiness, bridging a different metaphysical dimension entirely. The hustle and bustle of the rest of the yard receded as Genesis approached them. Sitting among them in calm respite, he felt the swirl of the environment dial down. This was a partial clearing, a localized lull in the flux. Freed from the incessant input of contradictory signals, his mind had a moment to process. In the hush, the negative space of the environment gave new clarity, some intangible synergy reminiscent of how transductive thinking can unify subtle differences. Though at peace, he felt drawn to see more. So he left the meditative group, meandering deeper into remote corners of the yard. That's when he heard a grim commotion. A smaller boy was being shoved around by older kids in black jackets. No, not the same Nietzschean bullies. These wore an aura of simmering aggression. Their ringleader sneered, "We can break you any time." It reeked of negativity, of exploitation. The smaller child looked terrified. Genesis's heart pounded. He could keep walking, remain a mere observer, or attempt an intervention. Without a clear plan, but compelled by empathy, and perhaps by the sense of subversive possibility gleaned from the Dada children, he stepped in. "Wait," he said, voice quavering. "What do you get from harming him?" The bullies turned, startled, ready to lash out. But Genesis recalled a trick from the Dada swarm, a certain unpredictability. He dropped to one knee, recited a half-coherent poem about metastability, variety, the irreducible swirl of intensities in the pre-individual field. He inserted bursts of nonsense words that he had gleaned from the dancing group. The bullies paused, confusion creeping across their faces. Then, ironically, they softened. One asked, "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering directly, Genesis described how each of us is in the process of trans-individual becoming, that hostility narrows potential, that synergy fosters new emergences. He half-quoted Simondon, though he didn't cite him by name, about how each of us never stands alone but is shaped by an associated milieu. The bullies were not wholly convinced, but their tension decreased. They tentatively invited him to shoot hoops with them, a gesture of partial acceptance. Thus began a new phase. Genesis recognized that in stepping up to help another, he'd found an impetus to shape the environment itself. He formed the Metastable Crew, a ragtag group from different corners, a few Dada dancers, a contemplative from the Buddhist garden, a couple of Piaget kids, even a reformed bully. They came together to hold mini performances in the yard. They staged bizarre Dada-inflected dialogues on stage, folding in subtle philosophical references. They invited the Cartesian kids to debate the Lacanian mirror group on the nature of selfhood. They discovered that bridging these micro-worlds unleashed new lines of synergy. The entire environment slowly evolved, becoming more integrated, more open to transformation. The children recognized that some measure of subversive play was essential if they hoped to transcend rigid frameworks. They found echoes of McLuhan, awareness of the mediums shaping their perception, and of Virilio, a sense that they must watch out for the accidents lurking in unbridled speed. They drew from Simondon's approach to trans-individual synergy. A new dimension emerges when pre-individual potentials are integrated rather than suppressed. In short, each cluster overcame some measure of reductive closure. The Piaget group recognized that pure formal logic doesn't preclude emotional expression. The Dada dancers discovered the need for some structure in order for their subversions not to collapse into meaninglessness. The bullies, touched by glimpses of empathy, realized that raw aggression can mask a deeper longing for creative expression. A sense of a bigger project took shape. They relabeled corners of the yard with new conceptual signposts referencing phenomena from the expanded glossary: transduction corner, variety nexus, recursive reflection hall, amplification alley, allopoietic workshop, metastable lab. They realized that each concept gave them another tool to interpret or shift their environment. The sense of synergy was not without friction. Indeed, synergy arises partly from friction, from the impetus to solve local crises. Surges of negativity or confusion recurred. The bullies sometimes relapsed, the Dada dancers sometimes exhausted themselves. But the emergence of the metastable crew functioned as a transducer of feedback, bridging subgroups and forging a newly stable though dynamic structure. In an echo of Ashby's law of requisite variety, the crew recognized that the environment's complexity demanded robust internal variety among them. They needed diverse skill sets, viewpoints, and energy levels to handle the ongoing swirl of new challenges. They found ways to incorporate environment scanning. Someone perpetually strolled the yard to note emergent tensions or events. They set up collateral information channels by which each cluster reported ephemeral events so they could respond quickly. They maintained a sort of algedonic meter, gauging the pulses of joy and distress among the children. They recognized from reading scraps on amplifying intelligence that collectively they could handle issues no single child could handle alone. Some started calling the yard synergy a cybernetics of crisis, an attempt to mitigate local meltdowns while fostering creativity. A new sense of hybrid authority emerged, not top-down, but a network of partial leadership. Each subgroup retained autonomy but fed crucial data to the crew. In the center of the yard, they erected an odd structure from random planks and leftover metal piping. On each surface, they scrawled references to transductive thinking, synergy, morphological resonance, and more. Surreal colors painted the structure with nonsense slogans. They placed an archaic mirror on one side, an homage to the Laconian mirror group, and a giant chalkboard on another, inviting the Piaget kids to codify newly gleaned knowledge. The Dada dancers scribbled nonsense poems in the margins. The Montaigne bullies, some who had rebranded themselves, pasted reflections about will to power but tempered by empathy. This contraption became a living symbol of the yard's emergent cosmos, part confessional booth, part performance stage, part bulletin board for ephemeral announcements. Teachers occasionally watched from the periphery, awed by the yard's organic transformations. But the teachers mostly let the children build their strange collaborative experiment. It was as if the system was self-regulating. Each newly introduced tension soon found a partial resolution, or at least an open forum for debate. The principle of variety attenuation was subtly at work. The yard's complex swirl of possible actions was not stifled, but neither was it allowed to explode into incoherence. They discovered that constraints, like shared rules for events or a schedule for recitals, did not kill spontaneity but helped guide it. Still, not everything was harmonious. Some kids found the new synergy intimidating. They missed the old boundaries. They craved the comfort of simpler logic or more absolute cynicism. They sniped from the sidelines or tried to form enclaves of exiled logic or pure negativity. The crew recognized that the process of individuation never ends. As Simondon would say, every step of resolution leaves new tensions or opens new potentials. Perfect harmony is never attained, metastability is the norm. One luminous afternoon, while Genesis wandered near the once summer zone where the bullies had cornered smaller children, he found that space transformed. A rotating puppet show was in progress. The bullies, who had not exactly become pacifists but had found a new way to channel their intensity, were performing comedic sketches about the illusions of hyper-rational thought and the meltdown of pure nonsense. Laughter rippled through the small audience. Genesis marveled at how subversion turned cruelty into comedic critique, how a bit of Dada infiltration had catalyzed an entire new structure of expression. In parallel, the old Cartesian group had not dissolved but softened. They'd begun to dialogue with the Piaget kids on questions of how to test rational claims in the face of new data. They'd invited the Laconian group to examine illusions from the standpoint of methodical doubt. They never abandoned the importance of reason, but they allowed that reason can be integrated with chaotic creativity. Over time, Genesis occasionally saw them step outside their chanting. Freed from their monolith of cogito ergo sum, they introduced disclaimers like, but perhaps the metamorphosis of the self in trans-individual synergy can also yield existence proof. In short, they recognized that the ephemeral swirl of the environment was not wholly meaningless. In this emergent tapestry, Genesis felt a sense of fulfillment. He recognized the yard was a living demonstration of synergy, a realized phenomenon bridging the uncharted spaces between ephemeral subcultures. He saw that no single vantage was absolute. McLuhan's lines about media shaping sense perception resonated with how each cluster shaped their own medium for expression. Virilio's warnings about speed and accidents took shape in how each crisis, like the bullies attacking the smaller child, triggered a response that reshuffled group alliances. Simondon's notion of pre-individual potential, transductive unities, and the trans-individual domain found living exemplars in how the kids spontaneously built a higher-order coherence. The environment was no utopia, but it was undeniably an evolutionary stage, a place in dynamic flux, pregnant with new metamorphoses. At times, Genesis would slip away to a quiet corner and just observe. He liked to see how synergy surfaced in ephemeral creative bursts, a surreal puppet show here, a bizarre chalkboard demonstration there, a nighttime stargazing circle that invoked archaic cosmic awe. He suspected that new children arriving would also be stirred by the yard's swirl, forced to find their place. And so it continued, day after day, each cycle forging new tensions and partial resolutions. The yard had become, in short, an autopoietic environment, generating its own meaning, boundaries, and transformations in real time. He chuckled at the thought that each child's personal identity had become more fluid. Former bullies discovered hidden comedic talents. Formerly silent kids found themselves leading ephemeral tasks. The skeptics of identity, once locked in mirror play, started crafting short comedic sketches about illusions, bridging the comedic style of the ex-bullies with their psychoanalytic vantage. The yard's metastable crew itself was not a closed circle but a flexible aggregator. Some children left, some joined, always with the condition that they recognized the group's ethic, synergy, empathy, creative interplay, and a refusal to let negativity dominate. They used the environment as a massive open system, a testing ground for emergent ways of being. "Look at the swirl," a child said to Genesis one day, pointing at a broad pool of neon chalk smeared across the asphalt, left from some ephemeral performance. "That swirl was me last night, now it's half washed away by the dew." The transience made it precious. Another child pointed to the horizon and said, "The environment breathes illusions, illusions feed synergy, synergy births new illusions." And Genesis found that poetic. He realized that illusions in themselves, if recognized as illusions, can be seeds for new creation, not merely traps. In the final analysis, the yard became a tapestry of co-evolving mediums, ephemeral illusions, rational pockets, and subversive play. The children built an ecosystem that thrived on complexity, recognized negativity as a call to adaptive reorganization, and fostered a shared sense of emergent identity. Each microculture, Cartesians, Dada dancers, Lacanians, bullies, Piaget testers, meditative mystics, surreal performers, contributed unique qualities. Through interplay, they increased the yard's overall variety, enabling a robust response to new tensions. Genesis, no longer the awkward newcomer, had become a key node for bridging subgroups, a living example of the endless process of individuation. He recognized that even he was incomplete, that further transformations lay ahead. Yet he felt a quiet satisfaction. The environment was now truly alive with synergy. If a newcomer arrived tomorrow, they would find the yard at once bewildering and strangely welcoming, a swirl of evolving possibility awaiting their own metastable tensions. They might slip, tumble into a sandbox with chanting logic children, or dance amid the Dada swirl. They might face bullies who have discovered comedic redemption. They might stare into a flickering mirror and see multiple versions of themselves. And they might eventually find friends who help them transduce their anxieties into creative acts. The yard, a living testament to the intricate interplay of partial systems, had become a metamorphic domain where emergent forms glittered, receded, then reformed, never static. And in that ongoing flux, one could almost hear the echoes of the glossaries from old tomes. Talk of synergy, variety, subversion, individuation, metamorphoses, a swirling feast of concepts that had taken living root in the footsteps, the chalk scribbles, and the collective beats of children forging new ways of being together.